Hello.
Our story begins in fury, pain, tears, and heartbreak. Anakin Skywalker was no longer a Jedi. Obi-Wan had failed. The Jedi Council had failed, and Palpatine was one step closer to success. It had been a turbulent year. Anakin was 13 years old. He'd been with the Jedi for barely 4 years, and it was over. This was the culmination of a variety of problems, starting with his emotions. He was bullied frequently by his peers, and he took it out on them from time to time. He was neglected, and his instructor was too stressed and unfocused. Obi-Wan stopped Anakin's youngling classes to train him as a Padawan early because of these developments. The problem is that aside from Qui-Gon forcing Obi-Wan to promise to train the boy, is that Kenobi wasn't prepared at all. He was so concerned about being the right master that he never had the time to become the Jedi Master only he could be. Obi-Wan was capable, but they would never know that now. Anakin also had Palpatine's voice in his ear, even from such a young age. Despite the Jedi being semi-negligent to Skywalker, he was also given some more freedoms than a typical youngling. This came to bite them in the back, and now he was leaving. Anakin was angry and upset, but he was also the one to tell Obi-Wan that he no longer wanted to remain a Jedi. He chose his path selectively, and he needed to accept it. On the steps of the Jedi Temple, he told his would-be master that he didn't want to be a Jedi anymore. He wanted to save his mother and be a free person. Anakin didn't have the words all put together coherently in his head, but that was the best he could scrounge up. He walked away slowly, and Obi-Wan tried to stop him, telling him that he could be a better instructor. They could learn to work one-on-one, as Qui-Gon would have. But Anakin continued walking. Whether he was afraid to believe that Obi-Wan was capable of that or not, he didn't know. Anakin was also unsure if he could even continue walking. He didn't necessarily want this, and he didn't want to be alone, but somehow that felt more comforting than staying with the Jedi. Slowly, he descended the steps of the temple, and once he was out of sight from his former master, he collapsed. He held his legs close to his chest and wept. 13 years old, on a planet far from home, with no friends, no family, and nowhere to go. Obi-Wan didn't know his former student fell, but they would remain stationary for the exact same time. Neither would move. Obi-Wan waited long into the night, hoping that Anakin might come back, and the boy sat silently, waiting, and trying to find some sense of courage, but that felt impossible to grasp. Around midnight, Coruscant Standard Time, Anakin would leave the temple grounds and wander into the city of Coruscant. It wasn't his first time doing this. He'd been out here several times before, sneaking out so that he could view pod races inside of cantinas and bars, or even grabbing some good eats not from the temple cafeteria, some street food he'd become more accustomed to on Tatooine. But now, this was real. Anakin did have the benefit of taking a couple credits to get by on, only now that he realized how little a couple credits really were. Republic credits at the very least on Coruscant could get him a warm bowl of soup or some water, but that wouldn't last him forever. Anakin was worried while he wandered around the outskirts of the temple and the city itself. From the ground level, it looked like the Jedi were powerfully standing over the suburbs, but there were those who lived in these houses that worked for the Order inside their temple. Anakin eventually found a street side bar and waited quietly. As he was sitting there, after a while, a chip fell into his hands from a passerby, a hooded individual, someone shorter but unrecognizable to Anakin in the moment. This individual gave him something. He twisted the chip around in his hand and the street vendor gasped, looking out the bar side to see where that man or woman went. He looked back to Anakin and asked if he knew who that person was, and Anakin didn't. The bartender explained that what he was holding was a Republic Academy medallion. Anakin's face still wore a confused expression, and the man told him that these medallions were basically get-in-free cards. Typically, a senator, advisor, or sponsor would pay thousands of credits to get someone that medallion. It took a lot of familial and political leverage to get into the Republic Academy on Coruscant. The bartender snapped the medallion from Anakin's hand and twisted it around, showing him on the other side the logo of the Coruscant base, and then planted it back inside of Anakin's hand. He told the kid to scram. Don't let anyone see that thing. Keep his credits and buy a ride over to the building and get in. Anakin felt bad though and offered to pay, but the bartender, believing that Anakin was one of the kids from the local area, wanted him to get out. He told Anakin to always pass on the neighborhood to others. Anakin didn't really know what that meant, but even though the town just around the temple wasn't necessarily lower income, it wasn't the extreme wealth of those who lived in the skyscrapers. Essentially, the bartender wanted Anakin to carry the good virtues of the neighborhood, which prided itself on their etiquette and kindness, inspired by the Jedi, of course, to those he met on his journey. Once he arrived at the superstructure, he gasped in surprise. It wasn't as massive or ancient as the Jedi Temple, but it was a remarkable structure. Banners of the Republic flag draped off of it, and a marshal wearing a blue uniform stepped out of the building and confronted him, asking who the boy was. Anakin stuttered over his words, and the cab behind him sped away. He turned back and then presented the medallion. The marshal investigated it ever so briefly, before putting it down and asking Anakin for his guardians. He told the man that he was a former Jedi, he didn't know anyone, and his mother was on Tatooine. The man looked confused for a moment. Was Tatooine even a planet? Many core citizens didn't care about the Outer Rim. This man, like many others who joined, didn't care about Syndicate territory or people suffering or the slavery. He was here, like many others, for political leverage because his daddy had a big pocketbook and had the right contacts. The man, though, did tell Skywalker to keep that information about being a former Jedi secretive. No need for the other kids to see him losing out on the Order as an additional weakness. He slapped Anakin's back and pushed him into the building. Skywalker would have some basic processes to go through: fingerprinting, blood samples, a bit of physical exercise, and some mental tests. The academy on Coruscant was elite and impossible to get into, but it was by no means as challenging as the classes inside the Jedi Temple. Anakin, early onto his training, after being accepted by a man named Colonel Stortru, or Professor, whichever the students preferred, he'd be equipped with a stun blaster and sent into training. Being that Anakin never received his lightsaber by the time he left, he didn't have much training aside from the Boken sticks. Similarly, somehow students would make fun of him for being a Jedi dropout. No one had ever met someone rejected by the Jedi Order. That's because many people who didn't make the cut were employed inside the temple itself. The Jedi tried their best to be fair to everyone they brought in, especially those who didn't pass their youngling trials. The same would have been the case for Anakin, but he left the Order too soon. This sucked. Like, it really sucked. He was at least permitted to have human emotions, but the kids inside the Republic Academy were even worse. Not to mention that there were older kids involved with the younger kids, and they picked on him too. At least at the temple, they were separated by age range, and skill within that age range, to best provide students with the most chances at success. Here though, they lumped the children together, because the military, if you could really even call it that, hadn't seen any reforms in the last 200 or so years. Even though being in the academy sucked, he would train really hard. With other cadets, he'd participate in regimental training and workouts. There were study courses, and Professors Stortru and Tragar were hard on Anakin. In the academy, professors would stick with a specific group of students until they finished, and then start over with a new group. In theory, it would help students build strong bonds of trust with their teachers, and help them grow in their training much more efficiently. There wasn't conclusive evidence to support this, but again, there hadn't been reforms in centuries. Anakin's training was very difficult, and every so often a new student would be kicked out, some would drop out, and new ones would be brought in. Core citizens with great affluence had varying habits with their children. Most of them sent their kids to basic primary schools or private schools, and then shipped them off to the academy, which was basically a boarding military school. A lot of the times when these kids returned home for breaks, they'd have new siblings. It was a machine, and only the super wealthy could profit off of it. Anakin would stay inside the complex during these breaks and continue training because, well, he didn't have anywhere else to go. He still hated the regimental studies, but he got better inside the academy because he wasn't permitted to do anything else otherwise. Tragar stuck his neck out for Anakin and kept him safe. But even though it was Colonel Stortru who allowed Skywalker in, he was the most critical voice of him, and frequently threatened expulsion. This stressed Anakin out a lot. but Shortshrew believed it was good for character. The kid needed some thick skin, even holding the Outer Rim heritage over Anakin's head and telling him to be a bit tougher, like the Hutts. Colonel Tragar was not like that. He was very kind and frequently held study sessions with Anakin, so that they could get everything down and work towards obtainable goals. He also put the young cadet into contact with one of his old elementary school friends. Everyone from the elite class had connections. Tragar was no different. The man was a sponsor of sorts, but he was without a wife or children. His name was Mr. Cathur. He was looking to help someone grow in their career, potentially even give them a chance. But truthfully, there weren't very many people without opportunity floating around the academy. Mr. Cathur was told about Anakin and immediately sponsored him. And even when there were breaks, Anakin was able to come to one of his estates. It'd be very weird if Mr. Cathur was there, so it was basically a high-rise in the financial sector that he used when he didn't feel like flying home. There were maids and so forth, so Anakin wasn't alone, and Mr. Cathur was never there when Anakin was there. But it was both a show of the extreme wealth on Coruscant and a show of some hospitality. Cathur wasn't a very fuzzy person. He was a bit cold and calculated. Being that he was a stock trader, it made sense. Nonetheless, Anakin was grateful that there were some people in his corner. In the following years, Anakin and Mr. Cathur would adopt a more father and son relationship. Before that though, for his first Life Day celebration under Cathur's sponsorship, he just asked for Shmi's freedom. She would be brought back to Coruscant and permitted to live within the financial residence. Shmi would, with Mr. Cathur's help, get her a job where she wasn't working like a dog or a slave. It was an office job and boring, but it was what she wanted to feel like she wasn't leeching off of him. Ironically, it wasn't even a dent in Cathur's finances. Palpatine, on the other hand, knew where Anakin was. He was, of course, the person who dropped the medallion into Anakin's hand. He was at the base of the temple and followed Skywalker around for hours, right after he left, which isn't weird at all. The Chancellor was the reason Anakin left the Order, and he made scheduled visits to the Academy, and even started bolstering his budgets after Anakin's acceptance. Palpatine assumed he'd have an easier time interacting with Skywalker at the Academy, but ironically was a bit more challenging this time around. The Jedi had more interactions with the Chancellor, and were more likely to work with him or protect him. Senate commanders were much more likely to be around the Chancellor instead of Republic Academy cadets. But Palpatine was able to get the idea into Anakin's head that it was he who got the medallion to him and changed his life for the better. When Anakin reached the age of 17, he was much better off. He was working hard, studying like a true cadet, physically trained and strategically sound. He had during this time found a great interest in old and High Republic battle tactics. Some Jedi did become relevant, from the High Republic, Avar Kriss, Vernestra Rwoh and their band of Jedi Crusaders. As for the Old Republic, Jace Malcolm, Bastila Shan, and further back, Revan, were points of interest for strategic relevance for him. Thanks to some in-depth conversations with Mr. Cathur, he learned a very important lesson, that inspiration can come from anything. For the rich man himself, he found inspiration in music and theatrical arts, but he specifically referenced classics and how they frequently resurge in new media. Those two are inspired from even older forms of art, while combat had been around since the dawn of civilization, and Mr. Cathur and Shmi provided Anakin with textbooks and history books for everything he was interested in. Cathur was also able to get holograms of old battles, some saved deep within Republic archives, and Anakin would lose himself inside of those old transmissions. Thanks to some tech inside the Academy, he was able to use tactics and reframe historical victories and losses against the Sith, the Nihil, various other splinter groups, and so forth. Professor Tragar would oversee this, and thanks to his new interest in studying, Anakin would build up a group of friends. The first of those friends was a Chandrilan boy named Jersaw Sword. He was 18 years old, and from one of the aristocratic families on the planet. He requested to be on Coruscant so he could stay away from his family. He and Anakin became friends during one of the government-mandated holiday breaks, and they became pretty much inseparable after that. They'd frequently, on those holiday breaks, stay with Shmi at Mr. Cathur's financial residence. The next of his friends was Nico Thoran. who came from a local business tycoon. Her father made his millions off of buying up properties, gutting everything and putting in more financially stable businesses. He was like a monopoly man. Nico joined the military so she could run for local mayorship of the Coruscant Federal District. The last two of his friends were a brother and sister duo of Colseen Eves and Alina Sol Eves, which were from Coruscant too. Their mother made it big as a senator's aide before shifting to her own political career. She made a ton of credits off of investors and playing her hands right. She was no longer in the political game, but she was set for life anyways, thanks to donors she bailed out during Chancellor Kaz's term a couple years back. These 5 friends became a group over the years since Anakin joined the academy. He adored them, and the feelings were shared. Typically, for exercises in the older courses, it helped having a crew to be comfortable with. They would rotate command positions during these training exercises, though most of these regiments included practicing with dreadnoughts and corvettes. They weren't actually in the ships, but they were doing simulations. There also wasn't really a Republic military either, and these friends were preparing to command their own vessels across the edge of Republic territory. Their missions wouldn't be difficult, aside from fending off pirates and criminals, though battle and tactics were still very important to their work. Thanks in part to Mr. Cathur, Anakin was able to get along even better with his friends. Jersaw and Nico were individuals that shared his deep passion for military history and strategy. They would consult each other and develop new plans to beat one another. They also were the troublemakers in the group. Sometimes they'd sneak out and go to the clubs with fake IDs just for fun. Anakin's relationship with the Eves was much different. The older brother, while being a quintessential member of their group, was the weakest link strategically. He was the one held back, a failure of the group. He and his little sister tried to compete with each other the most, and he frequently was unable to keep up. Despite being the least capable among them, he was very intelligent and kept to himself. Most of Colseen's personality revolved around reading and art galleries, whenever he was permitted to see them. His younger sister, Alina Sol, was a much different story. She was a vibrant personality who succeeded well in the group. She, Jersaw, and Anakin were constantly in competition for the highest performing ranks. Nico was around there too, but she was closer to the weapons expert and most equipped with how to utilize them in combat instead of actual battle strategy. All the cadets had to do physical workouts as well. Nico jokingly referred to Alina Sol as Muscle Mommy. She outsquatted Anakin, and he took that very personally. She also held the reigning title of Quadfather amongst her peers, and this friendly competition was the basis of her and Anakin's friendship. She was a little like her brother in regard to her interest in studies, but she hadn't been held back numerous times like Colseen had. She was the better child in her mother's eyes, but no one needed to know that. The group of 5 was pushing their way up towards graduating. They were a very happy group of friends, and they worked in coalition with one another. Despite their focuses on strategy, Anakin and his best friend in the group, Jersaw, spent a lot of time working in the Academy hangar bay. Skywalker missed working on ships or pod racers, and Colonel Tragar was kind enough to give him his clearance to tinker. There were some Academy classes that permitted recruits to fly Republic Z-95 headhunters designed by the sub-pro corporations back in the day. They would race them after fixing them up, and that was what really cemented their friendship. Anakin and Jersaw, at the current moment, were sitting in the mess hall, speculating on the crisis taking over the government in the galaxy. The two of them had aspirations of serving with each other near the Outer Rim territories, but now they were concerned about having to fight against Republic worlds. There was no mistake, this was a rising civil war, and everyone inside the Academy knew it. Tensions were high, but they continued talking. They were young, but talking about their futures. As best friends, they aspired to be admirals and retire as Republic powerhouses. Jersaw never wanted to go back to Chandrilla, and since they usually roomed during the holidays, they were hoping to buy apartments in the same building. They could also, as admirals, buy high-caliber speeders and get matching license plates like guns and ammo or something like that. These were the happier conversations that broke up their worries over the split in the galaxy. Palpatine was a very positive influence in Anakin's life, but they weren't as close as the Chancellor wanted them to be. And even though Anakin was still a very Force-attuned individual, he didn't practice his Jedi lessons frequently, if at all. The Force still acted through him, but it wasn't a part of his daily routine. He simply believed in the Force but didn't practice it. More than anything, he'd use it to impress his friends or to grab something when he didn't want to get up, which honestly was the most practical thing in his line of study. As he and Jersaw were talking about their futures as brothers in arms, their friend, Alina Sol, entered with a beaming smile. She told them that Colonel Tragar had some spare tickets for the intergalactic opera showing. They were thinking about going and using the tickets to get some drinks instead. Anakin, being the youngest, only by a year, was the first out the door. She shoved the two boys out in front of her, and they left, forgetting about the turbulent situation unfolding until it all actually faced them. Even without Palpatine intervening in Skywalker's training, he was able to soar out of his classes early. All of his peers were with him for graduation, and he passed a year earlier than most, so he passed with all of his friends. He, like Jersaw and Nico, would get Chancellor corvettes to operate around the mid-rim. They all opted for deployment, so they'd be saying goodbye to the Eve siblings for who knows how long. Despite serving on different vessels and being very young, they were in command. This was the luxury of the Coruscant Academy. It wasn't common for someone from the Coruscant Academy to request deployment. Nico, Jersaw, and Anakin were just unique types, but it's why they were immediately given command over crews and vessels. Typically, these officer types would fan out on Coruscant, use their veterans' discounts and status to score big with clubs, girls, or boys. It was a good way to get attention, and because the times were still reasonably good, no one complained about the veterans being championed like heroes for doing absolutely nothing. Alina Sol wanted to be out there with her friends, but her older brother had gotten sick just before graduation, and she wanted to stay with him until he got better. Colseen was struggling, but his mother would get him to the best care in all of Coruscant. Anakin and Alina Sol would stay in contact long distance, and he would keep her updated on their grad crew. He, though, was doing whatever he could to get himself noticed. The trio sent out to this territory were all captains of their own individual ships. These were not formation fleets, just individual vessels protecting territory with high crime rates. And by protecting, they would sweep in, fire a couple warning shots, and go back to space. It truthfully was quite lonely for Anakin. He enjoyed his crew, but he missed his friends from the academy. They were his favorite people in the whole galaxy, and they were spread out. He'd hear about Nico demolishing a pirate fighter attack or Jersaw leading a ground assault on a criminal hideout, but that was it. Anakin had his own combat, and he found a certain comfort in leadership during these skirmishes, but it didn't really mean a whole lot to him, because he couldn't celebrate it with his friends or his mom, or even, at that, Mr. Cathur. His crew adored him because he was a working man. Just like Jersaw, they led by example. Nico was a psycho. She continued finding ways to use explosives. She honestly may have just been a pyromaniac who found themselves in command accidentally, but her leadership wasn't faulty by any means. She was just out of her mind. In the following 2 years, there'd be some semi-major developments. Anakin had an array of conflict that he managed to be victorious in. Palpatine played a very big part in making Anakin a hero before the Clone Wars started. This would allow him to transfer to Admiral just in time for the war. Though in his personal life, while Anakin and Jersaw continued to blossom as friends and grow through their careers, their friend, Alina Sol, lost her dear brother. It was a heartbreak, but even the greatest medicine in the Corps couldn't stop the disease from slowly killing him. Anakin would be there by his friend's side when he died. The others tried to be there, but Anakin was the only one who could make it. It was both for Colseen and for Alina Sol. The mother would be devastated, but she was grateful that one of her son's classmates could be there for him. Outside of this personal loss, Nico went semi-rogue and faced a court-martial for acting a little erratically. Anakin exercised some of his influence with Palpatine by accident. The Chancellor was commending Skywalker for his work in the rims, but Anakin was only concerned about Nico's trial. It was here where Palpatine would offer his support to get her back into the field, which Anakin appreciated. After Colseen's death, Alina Sol needed to be away from Coruscant, so she joined her best friend, Anakin, in the rims. She wanted to be there for her mother, but she pushed everyone away from her. As Mr. Cathur had been with welcoming Shmi and Anakin and Jersaw, They would also be very welcoming to Alina Sol whenever there were holidays or breaks away from deployment. It was a much less toxic environment to be in. Alina Sol's mother was a long-time widow, and having just lost her son, sent her into a spiral that placed her into a facility. Mr. Cathur, as always, promised to be the at-home support for Miss Eves. Much of this turbulence, though, didn't really matter. Anakin wasn't politically active, but he paid attention to the developments surrounding the war. Thanks in part to Obi-Wan Kenobi watching over Senator Amidala, she was able to bid with him to stay on Coruscant. Master Kenobi, who had instructed his student to knighthood since Anakin's departure, was willing to support Padme, as she led the Loyalist Committee to refuse the commission of a Grand Army of the Republic. No matter what, though, eventually, the floodgates would open, and war would begin. Republic officers from the Academy would be thrown at combat and given their chances to succeed. Since Skywalker had become an admiral right before the beginning of the war, he was able to converse with Admirals Yularen, Killian, Coburn, and so forth on Coruscant before deployment into the Mid-Rim. There were various concerns for the clones and how they would perform, but Yularen, who had a keen eye for talent, assured Anakin that he would be fine. Without interaction or training from the Jedi, Palpatine wasn't able to hope that Anakin could just become a powerful Sith overnight, so he paired Jedi with Anakin, hoping that there'd be some quote-unquote illegal training. Quinlan Vos was his assigned Jedi, someone who was likely to break the code to do what he thought was the right thing. On his crew, though, he'd have Captain Jersaw, weapons expert Nico, and executive strategy director Alina Sol. Some of these positions weren't really necessary for a small fleet, and truthfully, Jersaw rejected a promotion to Admiral so that he could serve with Anakin. Skywalker proposed that he step down and serve as Jersaw's captain, but his friend believed that Anakin's own work was more impressive, and Nico backed this, so Anakin couldn't really deny his friends' requests. The fleet with Quinlan Vos came with 4 Venators, 2 Acclimators, and 3 Arquentans cruisers. It was the largest fleet Skywalker worked with, but the aforementioned admirals gave him some assistance with handling this amount of troops. More than anything, Yularen suggested that he utilize Jersaw, Nico, and Alina Sol as captains of each of the other Venators. Admiral Yularen wasn't operating the same way with his fleet, but that was because he started out that way. It was good advice and it worked for him. Skywalker was immediately thrust into action. As Palpatine did with skirmishes before the war, he gave Anakin the chance to thrive. He really did too. His position as Admiral was very important. He got comfortable directing troops and leading fighter counters. Despite holding a firm, even micromanaging control over all fleet movements during and out of combat, he shared his power with his friends. They supported him, and they continued to fight against the droid armies. Space battles were challenging, but every conflict was a victory for Anakin, no matter how outnumbered he may have appeared to be. Skywalker didn't flinch in these combat zones, but losing troopers did a number on his mind. Without the Jedi training or losing his mother or ever losing a soldier during any of his skirmishes before, he took it very heavily when his clones died. Anakin adored the Kaminoan-bred troopers, but they were soldiers. They were created to be killed. Quinlan Vos shared similar sentiments. He was an odd Jedi to serve with, not like anyone Anakin had ever met. But as Palpatine predicted, the Jedi Master would instruct Anakin in some varying ways. He had heard about Skywalker's departure, and he had felt bad that things ended so unceremoniously with him. He did explain that Obi-Wan took it very personally and hard, and wished that he could have been the right instructor for Skywalker. It did mean a lot to him, but in the end, Anakin believed that this was the best path to be on. Being around Quinlan did mean that Alina Sol learned of Anakin's Jedi past for the first time. He didn't really talk about that part of his past, and his only friend who did know was Jersaw, because they were basically brothers. Though Quinlan revealing this part of Anakin's past helped further his own friendship with Alina Sol, and even Nico in some other ways, but mostly the former. The war was difficult, but on none of this group more personally than Shmi on Coruscant. She worried so much about Anakin, because he was on the front lines, fighting in battles. It was actually Professor Stortru who would check in on her from time to time, while Mr. Cathur was off on business trips to Coruscant's elitist moon, Hesperidium, which is where all the richest people in the core lived. Cathur had to maintain his finances by cutting deals and because he wasn't in love with Shmi and cared mostly about his assets, he checked on her when it best suited his business needs. Professor Stortstrom was an odd man, but he was kind enough to keep an eye on Shmi per Anakin's request. On the front lines, Anakin led Republic troopers into more battles. From his bridge, he commanded assault after assault, and while Palpatine didn't need a maverick like Quinlan becoming the face of the Republic war effort, it was a necessary choice because of what it meant for Anakin's development. With more ships being added to Anakin's ranks and his battle prowess developing further, the war became a playground for him. His Academy friends made strategizing easier, but clone troopers and Quinlan were welcomed allies. They provided intel and ideas that gave Anakin the chance to be the most effective admiral in this side of the military. He, within the first 7 months of the war, would be one of the only Republic leaders to not lose a single battle. During a break point during their deployment, after they freed a system from Separatist control and waited for support Pelta-class frigates to exit from hyperspace and deposit supplies to the formerly blockaded planet, Anakin, Jersaw, and Alina Sol met on the bridge of the flagship, called the Half Moon. It was night mode on the ship, meaning all the lights were dim, and Anakin gave the bridge crew the night off. He planned on waiting the full night inside the bridge alone, just because he wanted time by himself. And he had been alone, until his friend from the ship across the way joined him inside the bridge. They spoke about the war, and Jersaw, for the first time, started to confess some senses of homesickness. Having seen the clones die, having watched them lose their lives and their camaraderie with their brothers, it gave him a new perspective. His family feuding seemed so minuscule in comparison to what they were experiencing here. He told Anakin that he hoped that maybe, once the dust settled, that Skywalker could come and meet his parents and his older sister. Anakin loved that idea. Much of the disruption between the swords hadn't been discussed, like Anakin's past with the Jedi. The war changed Jersaw a lot, and he just hoped that someday when the war ended, they could see the galaxy become what it was when they were younger. It was just so grim now. In the coming hours, Anakin would be joined by Alina Sol, who was an early riser. She went to sleep earlier in the night, and Anakin was finally starting to get heavy eyes. By this point, Jersaw had abandoned the Half Moon and went to his own vessel. Unlike their friend, Alina Sol didn't have a lot to say regarding home. She was a little cut off from her mother, but that had always been a fluctuating relationship anyways, even though she was a favorite child. Her strength had always come from her friends and from within. Anakin was a part of that strength, and he offered her optimism for the end of the war. She, though, didn't believe this conflict would find resolution after a year of combat. He wondered why she thought as such, and she shrugged her shoulders. She believed there was something larger at play here. The Jedi were dragged into this war. Why would they be involved here if they couldn't be involved in the Rims during the pirate attacks earlier or before the war? There were actual answers for this, but it was beyond their pay grade, and it was a valid question. She told her Jedi Knight Admiral to go and get some rest. Maybe a misplaced tease, but it landed nicely. It was a good joke. Before he left, she asked him a question. He was almost out of the bridge when he stopped and turned around. Alina Sol asked if he would promise to accompany her to the Coruscant Botanical Gardens. He almost smiled instantly. He was too tired to think of something clever, so he just promised and abandoned the bridge. The following weeks would see combat, but as Anakin's fleet picked up more vessels and he further developed his strategies, he planned to lure General Grievous into a trap, using Quinlan Vos as bait. During their previous engagement at Vandor, one of their capital ships had sustained heavy damage. Anakin positioned the Venator off of a moon in a neutral system. It would be a little risky, but it's why they were doing it. Jersaw and Nico volunteered to be inside the vessel that sent the distress signal. But basically, with Quinlan Vos inside their ship, they'd send out a damaged ship request for reinforcements, with the intention that Grievous bite the bait. The Republic fleet, led by Skywalker, would be there to blitz them. As an added note, they needed crew inside the vessel so they could lure the Separatists in, because if they scanned it and no one was inside of it, then they wouldn't be lured into the trap. It would take an hour or two, but the Separatist fleet led by General Grievous in the area would exit from hyperspace. They would approach the lone Venator, which was equipped with extra shields just in case, which they would need once the battle actually started. Anakin's fleet finally came around the moon in 3 different directions. It weakened the bulk of their force, but it was a massive distraction for Grievous. His main frigates came under siege, and his flagship was docking with a damaged Venator. He tried to pull away, but the vessel, despite being damaged, used the last of its power to fire on the stabilizers of the flagship, and forced the Separatist cruiser under Grievous's command to rely exclusively on the Venator itself. Grievous began his attack inside the halls, as Quinlan and the Volunteer force barricaded the hallways. Admiral Skywalker stood at the front of the bridge, directing his troopers and listening to relayed changes to the battlefield by Alina Sol. She mostly addressed damages to the CIS. There were some minor struggles in the dogfight, but nothing was going to stop their attack. They were in the clear. As they were making their push back, Anakin noted that Grievous's vessel hadn't pulled away yet. Jersaw and Nico at the last second decided that Grievous couldn't be allowed to escape, which he planned on doing. They destabilized the flagship during the boarding sequence so that they could trap him. Anakin gave orders for the rest of the fleet to move, and the Half Moon docked on the other side of the CIS flagship. They were going to wrap around and destroy General Grievous. Anakin took a pistol from his belt and walked from the front of the bridge. He told Alina Sol that she was in total command, and she, without even hesitating, moved to the hollowed table in the middle of the room and scanned everything on the battle map. Skywalker followed groups of clones into the corridors as they broke into the flagship. He may have not been the most qualified to be here, but he wanted to help. Clones ferried out into various locations. The commander of the team moved to secure the bridge, and the rest of the men poured through various corridors and picked off straggling B-1s and B-2s. Once they reached the other sky bridge, leading to the other Venator, they hurtled destroyed battle droids and dead clones. Anakin kept his eyes out for Grievous, but didn't see it. He rushed and rushed. The sounds of blaster fire became more and more audible, and Skywalker could hear the clashing of sabers. Some of his earliest instructions at the temple flooded into his head, but he pushed them out. He followed the men and unholstered his pistol. The clones around him split up and fired down different corridors, taking out battle droids. General Grievous and Quinlan Vos were trading blows. Just as they were fighting, though, clones hit the droid general in the back. He was blindsided, and so were the other droids. Anakin fired down the corridors and noticed a standout in the mix. Without even a second thought in his head, he rushed out from behind his men and sped down the hallway. He fired his pistol into a B-1 before unloading everything into a B-2 and ducking a punch that would have killed him. The weapon cooled off, and then he, now on the ground, fired into the face of the droid, destroying it, before crawling over another battle droid and finding his friend. Anakin's voice could barely be heard in the firefight as he cried out Jersaw's name, but his friend's eyes barely turned over to look at him. He wasn't able to move. Jersaw wasn't just shot, but crushed by a fallen B-2 battle droid. Anakin pushed the clanker off of his friend and helped him up into his lap as fire flooded over his head. Blue and red bolts covered the hallway, and Anakin removed his cap, asking his friend if he was alright. There were 2 shots that could be very deadly, and Anakin placed his hand over them. Jersaw grabbed his friend's hand and shook his head. They were going to detonate the Venator. It was a last-second move, but their comms were cut so they couldn't inform the fleet, and Grievous stopped them before they could ever reach the escape pods. They weren't supposed to get caught in the open like they did. Nico had just been killed down the other hallway. Anakin held himself together and told his best friend that they'd make it out of this. They'd go home and watch pod races, and reunite with his family and grow old together and start families in adjacent apartments so their kids could be best friends. He told Jersaw to stick with him until they got back to the Half Moon, and with all of what he had left, Jersaw thanked Anakin for giving him home, before falling lifeless in his arms. Tears slipped out of Anakin's eyes as he watched the soul of his best friend leave his body. Just behind him, before he could grieve, Quinlan Vos was thrown down the corridor past Anakin. Grievous charged the Jedi Master, and just as he passed him by, the Admiral stood up and fired straight into Grievous' back. The droid general whipped back around, swinging at Anakin's neck. His Jedi instincts were enough to keep him together to dodge the strike, but Grievous clawed Anakin's chest and slammed him back into the wall, and before he could shove a saber through Anakin's body, a green lightsaber exited the droid's chest. Grievous was killed instantly by Quinlan. Anakin was helped back to the Half Moon due to some internal bleeding. he never got a last look at his dead friend. All he'd have left were some pictures from the academy and graduation day. Alina Sol would finish up the rest of the assault. She would masterfully use every strategy concocted by their group to destroy the Separatists. It was quite the show too, because CIS reinforcements did come. But there was something else that Quinlan Vos would take with him back to Coruscant. It wasn't true in the slightest, but it was early war propaganda designed by the company called Shadow Feed under the control of Sullus Von Senator Tyshawn Nevolio. The propaganda was designed to incriminate Chancellor Palpatine. It was created before Dooku could ever make corrections or approve it. It was basically equatable to an AI deepfake, but with holograms and Star Wars technology. Not to mention, the Shadow Feed constructed a piece-for-piece signal modifier that essentially proved it came directly from the Chancellor's office with Palpatine's approved seal. It was Tyshawn's creation, because he had bids for greater power. It was transported with Grievous because Tyshawn intended to trust the droid general, but he got distracted by his love of lightsaber collecting and attacked Quinlan Vos. Point being, this was a completely fake hologram created to show a scripted, secret meeting between Palpatine and Dooku, discussing the beginning of the Clone War and how to manipulate both governments into their hands. Tyshawn was hoping to turn people against the Count and the Chancellor. It wasn't ever initially going to go through, and it would almost result in his death, but it was the perfect recreation, just to prove what was possible. A totally fake conversation that looked real and had the official, not even fabricated, the official seal of the Chancellor's office. It would fool any and every coder inside the CIS and the Republic. The Jedi now had access to it, and Quinlan Vos would return it to the Council. Anakin would make a relatively quick recovery, and it would go by without any problems. Alina Sol had her own private time to mourn her friends, but she was taking command over the fleet until Anakin and/or Quinlan returned. She and Skywalker would have time for another conversation inside the medbay to talk about their friends. Unlike the death of her brother, they were actually able to communicate much more freely. Part of this was due to her mother hovering around her after her brother died when she spoke to Anakin about it. Now they were semi-alone, aside from medical droids, which didn't care, so they just spoke about it. Thanks to the fact that Anakin's injuries weren't super bad, and he only had a tube in his left arm, they curled up together on the bed and spoke about memories of their friends, their times on Coruscant, all the lifting competitions, or inside jokes, or fake IDs at the bars, the good times, and what they missed the most about their friends and her brother. The sickness that took Colsine was inevitable, but the war, started by Palpatine and Dooku for political power, that was something unforgivable. It brought them both a sense of anger, but also a need for comfort, which came from one another. Jersaw and Nico never needed to die, and yet they felt their hearts ripped out because of it. They were all too young, not just the Academy graduates, but the clones too, hell, even some of the Jedi. Work on Coruscant, as it always was, constantly hit gridlock, but the Jedi were extra forceful because of the whole potential Sith thing. This wasn't of concern. Both governments may have been erupting inwards, but the war was still on the front lines. Nothing would change for the people who actually fought the battles until the most protected people in the galaxy made the right decision. Anakin would recover quickly and join Alina Sol on the bridge for another battle. It would be similar to the previous one. They'd be attacked by an even larger fleet, and it would be in the middle of their fight that they'd have to send ground forces to protect the surface, which was just inside of neutral territory and a mess to deal with. Alina Sol would cover the ground attack with some other clones in the bridge, as Anakin focused on the attacking Separatist fleet. The graduates developed a wave-like strategy. From above, it looked like an ocean wave, but vessels would move their engines forward and then backwards in a sequential wave to throw off the Separatist fleet movements. Against a regular sentient captain, it might not be effective. Sometimes it would be, but not always. However, it confused a droid's programming. They didn't have the adaptability to understand that the wave was just a trick. Battle droids assumed that the fleet was changing position rapidly and moved to counter it, which they couldn't do effectively. Anakin and Alina Sol mastered that in this battle, and once they won, they would learn that the Clone Wars were over, kind of. The Jedi made a move on the Chancellor, and with the grace of the Grand Master, they made a move to arrest the Count of Sereno. In this move, because of the proper evidence that no one had deciphered as fake, the Jedi were able to look as the neutral entity everyone wanted them to be. The Order had played the game on behalf of the Republic, and they believed in the democracy that held it together. But the deep fake created by Taishan fooled them all. The irony is, Taishan did get what he wanted. Dooku was removed from power, but the Separatist movement as a whole also crumbled, so Taishan would never actually rule. Part of this came from the fact that the CIS had been duped into fighting a war for Dooku. The other part is that the Jedi willingly chose to remove everyone. The status quo needed to be changed, and no biases could be used. Also, it did help that Dooku and Palpatine happened to actually be Sith Lords. It was truly a mistake, but Taishan was creating the most bizarre deepfake he could think of, and as it turns out, Palpatine and Dooku faking the war for the laughs was the real deal. The deepfakers wouldn't ever reveal their work, and instead use it for political leverage in the incoming election cycles. Anakin and Alina Sol would remain deployed for the next couple months, until the ceasefire and peace treaty were finalized at the Treaty of Mandalore. Anakin and Alina Sol would return to Coruscant, where they would stay in the financial manor with Shmi. Mr. Kurthur would be at the landing docks to greet Anakin and express great pride in his efforts to squash the Separatists. The war, though, even with it being over before the first year ended, had worn itself on Anakin's face. Losing his many friends and his men did its damage to him, but at least his close friend, Alina Sol, was still by his side. Her mother would also be there at the docks to meet her daughter and embrace her. It was a rewarding but bittersweet moment for Alina Sol. She and Anakin would spend weeks at a time around each other, and he would fulfill his promise to visit the botanical gardens of Coruscant with her, and it'd be there where they'd accidentally share their first kiss. And from there, they'd be pretty much inseparable, as if they were ever separated beforehand. They obviously didn't know it, but Jersaw and Nico had a running bet that Anakin and Alina Sol would fall in love with each other at the end of the war. Anakin felt truly betrayed by Palpatine. He didn't really express it outwardly due to the grief he held inside, and the fact that he had more important things to face. That truly was the difference in all of this. To him, Palpatine, aside from being an advisor of sorts, was just another politician. He pulled the trigger, but didn't carry the weight of death that followed the blast. That was what tormented the souls Palpatine sent to die for his war. Skywalker just hoped that the Jedi would make sure Palpatine paid for his actions. Dooku and Sheev would never be seen again anyways. Even though they weren't needed at the front lines, the two young lovers decided at the end of the peace talks to finalize their military contracts and retire from the war and combat and everything. They would remain in contact with Quinlan Vos and the clones they served with, but they had seen more than enough action. Also, Master Vos would put Obi-Wan and Anakin back into contact. They wouldn't be quite like brothers like Jersaw and Anakin, but they'd become good friends, and their troubled past would be forgiven by each other. Alina Sol would make the move to capture her boy and surprise Anakin with the proposal. It was a bit of a shock, like really surprising, and honestly, kinda nice. He obviously accepted and they'd get married in the following 2 years. They would have their own family in due time, and as they started to get a good life for themselves on Coruscant, lining up with their individual interests with aid from Mr. Cathur, they would be able to remain as far away as possible from any war. Honestly, and ironically, for Mr. Cathur, sponsoring Anakin was the greatest investment he ever made. Skywalker never asked for much from him, and if it weren't for Anakin and Alina Sol, the war would still be going on and he'd be bankrupt in 2 years' time. But they had saved him from that financial turmoil, and he would forever repay that back to Anakin. They'd be the heirs to his vast wealth, and he'd become more human around them, as said earlier, a more father figure to Anakin. Shmi would live long enough to see her grandchildren, and while the war tormented them both, Alina Sol and Anakin would live peacefully and happily in a galaxy reuniting with a new sense of purpose. And that, my friends, is a wholesome PP story, and special thanks to the patrons for supporting the channel. Smash that like button. Let's talk about the wholesome PP. This story, more than anything, I felt needed to be a story of camaraderie. I really don't think you can do a Republic Academy story without camaraderie. Adding these 4 original characters to the story was honestly so much fun, just because there's tons of people that we've never seen before, and who knows, we might see them again, we might never see them again. But having these characters here was a lot of fun. I really wanted to have the almost inverse situation with Jarsal and Anakin. Not that Jarsal falls to the dark side, but Jarsal is that lost individual. He's someone that dies unfairly, and it feels like your heart is ripped out, because he really shouldn't have died, and the war was so unnecessary. I think in this there's a certain irony. I play with it a lot in the Palpatine Visions video from the other day, but this is kind of Palpatine acting on something he thinks is going to benefit him, and it doesn't. I think Star Wars is a lot of like 1 through 10s, like there's a chance of something happening 1 out of 10 times or 5 out of 10 times and so forth. And this is one of those times where Palpatine acts to make the Jedi pay for whatever. It doesn't really work for him. In the previous video, obviously it did. With this story, I really wanted to interweave both family drama, kind of a little bit of, not political, but I guess militaristically political drama, a little bit of romance, and more than anything, camaraderie. I may have said that first, I don't remember. Camaraderie is really the main theme of the story. That's really what I wanted to capture the most, and I think that really is what holds all this together. I think the combat in the end, especially the battle with Grievous, is cool, but I really wanted camaraderie, which is really the concrete foundation of the relationship for Alina Sol and Anakin eventually on. It starts all in camaraderie. You know, she's the quad father. He's just, you know, skipping leg day, and you can't do that. So I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all. Spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.